Is there anyone? Well, access.
So what I want to do today is go into more depth about federalism. Federalism seems like it's a pretty easy, uncomplicated issue. That's not the case. Almost everything about American government is more complicated than what it appears to be, and I want to try to indicate to you today just how complicated it is, and really the writing assignment is an opportunity for you to kind of do some research and in one particular area and see what what you find. So again, some of this will be repetitive, some of it will be new because I'm going to go into more detail. The Founding Fathers embedded in the Constitution federal system, which divided authority, governmental authority, between national and subnational governments. We talked about this last time. Each government has distinct powers, but in fact, it's essentially a power-sharing relationship, and sometimes that sharing is collaborative in the real world today, and sometimes it's not. When you look at the organization chart of the federal government, I showed this last time as well, what I did not mention and what I need to call to your attention is that there, up at the top, toward the top, there are three branches. On the left, the legislative branch, in the middle, the executive branch, and the judiciary on the right. But note that everything in the bottom half of this organization chart is in fact a part of the executive branch of the federal government. And so the executive branch of the federal government, largely created by Congress and the President, Congress by passing laws that required the President or the executive branch to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, and the Congress saying, okay, we're going to create agency or department X, Y, or Z in order to implement this law or this policy. So the overwhelming majority, probably 95% of the federal government is in the executive branch. This is not because the executive, in my judgment, this is not simply because the executive branch tried to accrue power, but it's a consequence of, in fact, the way Congress works and the democratic process. We'll talk more about that later. And again, I showed this image of generic federalism, which indicates that in the federal system there are many bodies of government that are in fact placed between, quote unquote, taxpayers on the one hand and the national government on the other. And again, we showed this. There's a lot of government in between the national government and American citizens, almost 90,000 agencies worth, or governments worth, rather. Not agencies, governments. So, from my perspective, the strongest argument for federalism or for a federal system is that when you have subnational governments, in the United States we call them states, these governments can serve as training grounds and laboratories for policy innovation. Why is this important? Well, a political scientist once said that a law or a policy or a program is a bit like a hypothesis. If a legislative body passes a bill and it becomes law, we have certain, and they have certain expectations of the consequences of that law. And they have to allocate or appropriate money in order to see that that law is implemented. Well, we're a big country. We have over 310 million people. So rather than spend a huge amount of money trying something new, the argument goes, we can try a new program at the level of a state government or two. It will cost less money, and we'll see if it works. And if it works, everybody's going to know about it and want to adopt it. And if it doesn't work, we can cut our losses. So that's one of the major arguments for a federal system. Some would argue it's also appropriate for a nation that has a large size, both in terms of land and population. It allows for political subcultures to be represented, and it prevents, to some degree, excessive concentrations of governmental power. Those are arguments for it. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with all those, but other than to say I think the argument about policy innovation is, to me, the most compelling and interesting. Doesn't mean I'm saying it's right. I'm saying it's an interesting argument that needs to be taken very seriously. There are many arguments against the federal system, at least as it's practiced in the United States. And I'm going to go through them, but they're serious. One is states have limited resources. Compared to the federal government, keep in mind, the federal government can print its own money, our money. Federal government can run, and does usually run, annual budget deficits. State governments, most of them, are constitutionally prohibited from so doing. So states have fewer resources to do anything. Secondly, we've grown huge as a people and as a nation, and very often problems and needs of associated with our society and the needs of the American people are increasingly regional and national, rather than very local. A third argument, again, or part of a critique of federalism, is that it becomes a way for powerful states to block or resist national laws and programs, and that sometimes those states can be dominated by a single group or interest. In Utah, for example, it's Mormons. In Delaware, it's financial services firms. In Florida, perhaps it's elderly people. In Texas, it's energy companies and so on. So the argument, part of the argument then is, well, maybe there's a lack of diversity in some states that really disadvantages minority groups and even might facilitate discrimination against some minorities. Another argument or criticism of federalism is that it allows for and maybe even encourages inequalities and unequal distribution of basic rights and services across states. In theory, the rights of an American citizen ought to be the same in state X or state Y or state Z. Why should I or you have fewer rights in Texas, say, than you do in Michigan or Indiana or Delaware or Kansas? But in fact, a federal system enables that. Similarly, a federal system can facilitate problems in policy and program coordination. If you've got 50 different states or 20 different entities that are trying to coordinate the same program, it might make it very hard to do. And it may make for policy or program failures as a consequence of an inability to coordinate effectively. Some would argue that, and there are objective measures for this, that in fact state and local governments are actually less transparent to citizens, and that participation rates, citizen participation rates, citizen voting is much lower in state and local elections than national elections. If I asked you, well, what's your evidence for this? Well, one might say, is there anybody in the room who is unaware of who the President of the United States is? Probably you all know. But if I asked you who your mayor was, or who your councilman was, or who your congressman was, someone who is locally elected, people who are locally elected, you might not know. Probably there's some in the class who don't know who the governor is. And finally, and this is more recent, some state governments may lack or disrespect expertise and science. My favorite example here is the state of North Carolina, which passed a law that prohibited statisticians and scientists who are employed by the state from modeling the impact of global warming on the rise in the water along the North Carolina coast. You might think this is a minor thing, but if a state, for example, that has a significant coastline decides to develop that coastline without paying any attention to flooding, to water levels and that kind of thing, that's pretty stupid. So these are some of the arguments against federalism, at least the way it operates. We mentioned the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 last time. And what I want to try to suggest to you about powers is this is and how they're allocated by the Constitution. The reality is a little more complicated. Yes, federal law trumps state and local regulations, at least according to the Constitution, except when it doesn't. So that Barta says, for example, the Supreme Court defines the powers of the national government. Well, yes, until somebody defines them a little bit differently, and only when a relevant case is decided by the court and that decision is actually implemented. The idea that the Supreme Court casts a final vote on anything, it seems to me, is fundamentally incorrect, and I suggested in talking about Brown v. Board and the Miranda cases last time that in fact the Supreme Court does not have the last word. So federalism's history used to be simple up until perhaps 1929 or 1930, the beginning of the Great Depression. State governments, subnational governments, and the national government were basically two separate entities. They didn't mix a lot. They didn't have much relationship with one another. The size of the federal government, the size of the executive branch was relatively small by today's standards. And with the Great Depression, the nature of our federal system changed dramatically. There were other forces as well, and I'm going to talk about those. But it's important to understand, in this or perhaps the last generation, many people say 9/11 changed everything. Well, whether one agrees with that or not, the same can be said about the Great Depression. The Great Depression and the government response to it fundamentally changed a whole lot about the nature of American government and certainly the nature of the federal system, and I want to give you examples of that. Before I get to those examples, I want to talk about the powers. We talked about the Supremacy Clause and how it says in Article 6 that in any kind of conflict, federal law governs. But notice that both in the Constitution and over the course of time, based on decisions by the federal courts, the number and range of powers is more complicated than that. So we talked about enumerated powers, those that are explicitly laid out in the Constitution. We talked about implied powers and the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8. We talked about concurrent powers, powers that both state and national governments hold. We talked about, maybe we didn't talk about, but I'm going to mention inherent powers. Those powers that the courts have ruled should be considered powers that any government in the modern world has to have in order to survive. And we talked about reserved powers, those that are mentioned in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And so there's not just one set of powers, there's not just two sets of powers, there are multiple sets of powers that are either A, described or embedded in the Constitution, or B, now understood as being part of the powers of the governments of the United States based on federal court decisions. And these powers are not all consistent with one another, and they can be applied differently in different policy contexts. So and how those powers are allocated and interpreted can be changed over time, both by legislative bodies, by presidents, and by the courts themselves. We talked about these last three things. I'm going to move, and four things. I'm going to move through those quickly. Obviously, one of the major challenges to the federal system was the Civil War and the question of whether or not states could secede from the Union. And this is what, on the left, the image on the left is what federalism was up till roughly the Great Depression. And this is a kind of image on the right, the marble cake, where states cooperate with the federal government. And we'll see examples of that in a minute. But there's other kinds of federalism as well, and we'll mention those. So you need to understand, though, that it would be inaccurate to say that the Great Depression caused everything. There were, over a period of easily a century, of factors that led to the transformations in American federalism and to American government more generally. Before I go through these, I'd like to see if there are any comments or questions that students have. If you do, go ahead and raise them, keeping in mind that you're going to have to speak up so that I can hear. Somebody trying to say something? Or are you okay?
I think we need you to go a little slower.
Okay.
They're typing and trying to take notes, and I think they're getting behind just a little bit.
Okay. Well, most of what I just covered, we've already covered, is covered again in this, and we will post these videos. But this video should also be available online, and I already, and I need to know if it's not. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this live is because this relates directly to your writing assignment too, and so I wanted to make sure that you had this well in advance of when the paper is due. So what I want to talk about here, and there are a whole number of bullet points, is how American government and how American federalism began to change. And there are multiple factors. First, the secession of the southern states, of many of the southern states, the Civil War, and the essentially President Lincoln's and the countries forcing the states, the Confederacy, defeating the Confederacy militarily and reintegrating the Confederate states back into the Union. And so with that came with that came Amendments 13, 14, and 15. And a number of things are really important in those amendments. You need to read those amendments because they fundamentally change the nature of the Constitution. First, they abolish slavery. When you abolish slavery, you also transform representation in the Congress of the United States, at least the House of Representatives. And you also transform the number of electoral college votes for states. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, very, very important, not just for questions of equality and civil rights, but also the Civil War amendments become part of the justification for the incorporation doctrine, which we will talk about in greater detail. Bottom line, what the incorporation doctrine is a whole series over the course of at least 100 years, series of federal court, Supreme Court decisions that began step by step to apply the Bill of Rights to state and local governments. Voting rights were a part of Amendments 13 to 15. And one of the key points in these amendments, states were no longer allowed to deny American citizens rights granted by the national government. It's very important that you understand how Amendments 13, 14, and 15 had a significant impact, not just on the southern states, but on the American political system and ultimately American federalism. The second change is our country has grown dramatically. You know this. Initially, the colonies, the states were primarily east of the Appalachian Mountains. And of course, go west, young man. And we've gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean now, and even into it, with Hawaii being a state and Alaska being a state. So the geographic size of our country has dramatically altered over time, and the population of our country has dramatically altered. So we now have probably close to 315 million people living in the United States. Toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, industrialism and urbanization more and more often characterize our economy and our society. We were no longer a rural agricultural economy, but increasingly the American economy toward the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century became more and more industrialized. Factories grew up, manufacturing, and so on. And with that, so did America's urban areas. More and more people who were living in the country and coming to the country, more and more, it was greater and more likely they would be living in cities. And in fact, by the very early 20th century, a majority of Americans lived in cities. Another reason for the transformation in the scope and the size of the federal government is world wars and national security and defense. Certainly over the course of the 20th century, the United States became a world superpower. And wars cost money. Wars cost huge amounts of money. And they cause shortages. They destroy lives and goods that need to be replenished. Defense spending in the United States dwarfs defense spending in any other country. In fact, the defense spending in the United States is so high, it's larger than most of the other industrial societies or developed societies' defense expenditures. We way outspend people. Russia and the United States also are the largest arms merchants in the world. So, and if you're concerned about excessive centralization of governmental power in American government, nothing. I'm going to repeat this over and over because nobody ever talks about it. Nothing ever centralizes governmental power more than war. Because if you're not centralized in war and in national security, chances are you're not going to win. I'm not arguing at this point that that's good, bad, or in between. I'm simply saying this is a fact of political and economic and military life. War and militaries centralize power. It's also the case, and we'll talk more about this later on in the course, it's also the case that sometimes social changes occur first in the military. And I would suggest to you, if you look at the question of integration, racial integration in the United States, you go back and you look and you see that President Truman, after World War II, issued orders to begin to desegregate the U.S. armed forces, which were segregated through the end of World War II. You could do the same kind of thing with President Clinton and don't ask, don't tell, with respect to homosexuals serving in our military. And so, while it's true that wars and the military centralize power, sometimes they're also places where social changes can be introduced. Point 5, the Great Depression. What can we say here? We're talking about the early 1930s through most of the 1930s. We're talking about 25% unemployment. We're talking about soup lines. We're talking about widespread poverty. We're talking about people jumping out of buildings to their death because they could no longer face the economic disaster that they and their families confronted. We're talking about something much worse, much deeper. We're talking about something that was global, in fact, much worse than what we experienced in 2007, 8, and 9. And so the question before the national government and before the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, was, do we sit here and do basically nothing and just say, well, business will take care of it because the business of America is business? Or is there some responsibility to the people of the country to see that this depression is beaten and that it doesn't happen again? And so the federal government in the 1930s, against some serious opposition, initiated a series of programs to try to help the American people overcome at least the worst aspects of the Great Depression. And that that those endeavors, it seems to me, are reflected in the preamble, what the framers talked about in the preamble to provide for the general welfare and to try to help meet the needs of the American people. Bullet 6 is important and not talked about very much. Up until the Depression, and even after the Depression, state governments were still very powerful. They still are, but they were very powerful, and they were, yet they were really unable to cope with the Depression. They were unable to respond to the needs of the citizens in their states. And it's important to understand the nature of that incapacity of state governments. Ultimately, that incapacity was reflected in two Supreme Court decisions, Baker versus Carr and Westbury versus Sanders, in the early 1960s. But it's important that you understand this story because the story sits on top of the continued denial of voting rights, especially for African Americans, well into and through the majority of the 20th century. So, one of the reasons that the federal government became more and more powerful and significant as a focal point for the American people is that state governments did very little to meet the needs of the people. The question is, why is this the case? So, part of the reason it's the case is because a large number of citizens, because of their minority status, because of Jim Crow laws, had essentially no political rights. But there's a deeper and more fundamental issue going on in terms of the state's incapacity to meet the needs of the American people in the 20th century. And that is, over time, the population in the United States grew, the population in states grew dramatically, urbanization in the 20th century became more and more dominant. Yet the state legislative districts were never changed in many of the states. So what does this mean? What it means is that earlier, from many decades earlier, state legislative districts remained as they were, so that people living in rural and lesser populated areas had much better representation than people living in urban areas. These urban areas were the parts of the country were growing in population very rapidly. So why did this happen? Well, because state governments didn't do that much, and because if legislatures redraw the boundary lines to reflect changing distributions of population over many decades, they're going to be out of work. They're not going to get elected to the state legislature because their constituents aren't large enough in number, given the tremendous increase in America's population, and especially that population in cities. And so, political scientists sometimes would joke and say, well, trees and forests and cows and farms had better representation than people who lived in urban areas in many states of the Union. So through malapportionment, that's what it was called, M-A-L, apportionment, one word, all one word, malapportioned state legislatures meant that over time, most of the people in the states, even if they had voting rights, had totally disproportionately low representation. So if you have political rights, but the way legislative districts in the state are drawn, such as your vote really doesn't mean anything, what happens is you have no representation, and the needs and problems of a growing number of people, especially largely those in America's cities, were left alone. States didn't respond to them. And so they looked for other places where their needs could be addressed. And the most effective, the easiest, the most visible place those needs could be addressed is the national government. So what we have is a period of failed representation of growing urban areas and the people who lived in them. Many of these people were immigrants. Many of these people were, in fact, just like my grandparents. And so the states became, continued to be unable to represent and to address the needs of the growing population. And so people looked elsewhere. The two Supreme Court decisions I mentioned are interesting. Westbury versus Sanders and Baker versus Carr. They established the one man, quote unquote, one man, one vote principle, which led to broad, which led to the principle that legislative and congressional districts, both in the states and the national government, needed to be basically the same in terms of population. But what happened by that time, when those decisions were made, 1964, 1963, 64, 65, the implementation of those decisions was in a different context, in a context where America's suburbs were growing. And American suburbs began to have more people than America's cities. And so the 5 or 6 decades in the 20th century where the majority of the American people lived in large cities, they were never represented. And when those decisions, never well represented, and or fairly or equally represented, and when those decisions were implemented, the two court decisions were implemented, the beneficiaries politically were America's suburbs and the people who lived in those suburbs. 3 other points I want to make about transformations in American government and federalism. Democracy itself became increasingly an important value in American political discourse. Women got the right to vote at the end of the 2nd decade in the 20th century. African Americans effectively got the right to vote after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so what you have is a much larger electorate. What you have in the 20th century is not only the democratization of American culture, but greater opportunities for the average American citizen to have his or her civil rights recognized and to participate in politics. So what happens? What happens is that as the size of the population grows and the voting and political rights of citizens become more meaningful and possible to exercise, the number of demands on the political system grow as well. Democracy leads to many, many demands placed on the political system, on governmental institutions. The more people there are, the more politically active people there are, the more people with political and civil rights there are, the more demands that are going to be addressed to governmental bodies. And when those demands become meaningful and visible, those governmental bodies have to consider what they're going to do about them. Our economy continued to grow, sometimes very robustly in the 20th century, especially after the Great Depression and World War II. And so, and economic activity in a much larger population, that activity has consequences. One of the best examples of American capitalism is the rise of the American auto industry. Major employers. The world began to change when Americans could drive. And the national government, the Congress, and President Eisenhower established the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system is a huge accomplishment. It's a fabulous example of a public works project, but it also has consequences and costs. And whether it's bad air, whether it's bad roads that need to be in constant repair, economic activity, whether it's pollution, and then the more people you have, the more robust economy, the greater the reliance on natural gas and oil, and an oil economy, and the environmental consequences of that. So what you're talking about is a dramatically changing economic order in our history from primarily rural and agricultural to industrial. And that had consequences that were so widespread that governments, especially the federal government, had to address them. Economists call this externalities. The externalities associated with economic behavior, businesses, for the most part, really didn't address them. Businesses and the products they sold might cause them, but then the American people are left to deal with the consequences and results associated with those economic and technological changes. And finally, as we have already mentioned, state governments have very limited fiscal capacities and powers compared to the national government. They don't spend as much money. They don't have as much money. They don't want to raise as much money because that political officials in state and local government, when they increase taxes, they face serious problems, political problems, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the New Deal was essentially established under the Democratic Party, under a Democratic president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. That was his response. That was the president's response. It was his party's response to the Great Depression. And eventually, the programs established in the New Deal were upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court, and that changed dramatically the nature of the federal system. Republicans tended to oppose those programs. The Democrats tended to support them, and the result was a change, among other things, was not only new programs and social welfare programs, but also a change in the nature of American federalism. One of the things to keep in mind, very important, and that shows that that federalism has not been totally transformed, is that since the Great Depression, with the beginning of the New Deal, most of the domestic policy programs that have been passed by Congress are often implemented still by state and local governments. They're still administered by state and local governments. It's not as though some huge Washington, D.C. bureaucracy tells everybody else in the country what to do. Usually the political deal that is required to pass new domestic programs involves a new federal law which is ultimately not administered fully, and sometimes not even at all, by the federal government, but rather by the federal government, but rather administered by state and local governments. Just to give you one example of this, probably the poster child for the most national program that comes out of, and most long-standing program that comes out of the New Deal is Social Security. And if you work, in most cases, you're going to end up paying a payroll tax, which then over time you build up the payroll taxes that you paid, and when you get in your 60s, you can retire and get some kind of pension, some kind of Social Security benefit. And there are other benefits even before, depending on your circumstance, before you turn 65 or 66 or 7. But understand that in Indiana, for example, there are 26 Social Security offices. These are not people who fly back to Washington, D.C. every weekend. These are people who live in the cities and towns and villages in Indiana. They're your neighbors. They may work for the federal bureaucracy, but they serve the people of the state of Indiana. They live in Indiana, and they help people of Indiana receive the benefits that they're entitled to under the law. So, these are a few images that suggest how the federal system has changed. If you look at this bar chart, what you'll see on the left-hand side is that in 1920, a very, very small percentage of state and local revenues were actually supplied by the federal government. It looks like about 1.5%. In 2010, that was about 22%. More than a tenfold increase over 90 years. So this represents, what this says is the federal government has been returning more and more money to state and local governments for those governments to spend on benefits and services for those who are represented in those state and local governments, in those state and local jurisdictions. So that's what you can see visually right here, a tremendous change in the relationship between, certainly a revenue relationship, between the federal government and state and local governments. And so the federal government, over this period of time, especially after World War II, began to pass what are called grants and aid laws, programs, many of which had some federal guidelines. People and governors sometimes referred to them as mandates. But in practice, some of those requirements were often modified or waived. So the federal government then began to fund in significant ways through transfers. They're called intergovernmental transfers. Transfers of money from the federal government to state and local governments, especially state governments, become an increasing part of the fabric of American federalism. 120 years ago, this basically didn't exist. Now, state and local governments would virtually collapse. If you took away all that money, 22% of all the revenues of the average state or locality, they'd be in real trouble. They'd be laying a lot of people off. Again, you can see how over time, this is 1927 to 1940 even, the federal expenditures as a part of the totality of government expenditures in the United States increased. So too did state expenditures. Local spending did not, and in part this reflects the local economic impact of the Great Depression on the one hand, and number two, the beginning of the participation of the United States in World War II, or gearing up to participate in World War II, and the tremendous increase in national expenditures as a result. So one reasonable question is, well, why don't states do more? Why don't local governments spend more? And the simple answer to this question goes something like this. First, state and local governments legally and constitutionally can't engage in deficit spending. Second, state and local governments increasingly are in competition with one another in what is often a difficult economic or business climate. States and localities want to retain and attract wealthy people to live in their states and cities. States want to attract businesses. That's why they give subsidies. That's why they do tax forgiveness to their states, because they know businesses create jobs. If state and local governments raise their taxes too high, that becomes an incentive for businesses to relocate elsewhere if they're able to do so. If Indiana were to increase state income taxes significantly, say by, let's say, 20%, those who are wealthy in Indiana might say, gee whiz, you know, it's really damn cold here in winter. There's just a lot of snow. I don't see any snow in Florida. And I don't see any state income tax in Florida. Maybe we shouldn't be living in Indiana anymore. We can afford to move. So the problem that state and local governments now face, and one reason why the federal government is providing significant chunks of state and local revenues, is because states themselves fear that if they expand, if they grow their revenue, if they increase their taxes, this will be perceived as a less favorable business climate, and wealthy people who have the resources to move and leave the state will do so, and on balance, the economy will be even worse. Comments or questions at this time?
No.
Anyone? Okay, I'm going to continue unless I hear somebody shout. Okay, so this is a map of the states that currently have state governments with a Republican governor and a Republican legislature. Much of the country may even be larger than this. What I want to show you is the response to the Affordable Care Act across the country. Keep in mind that the next map I'm going to show you is about 6 months old. We are used to, one of the reasons I'm showing this to you is because there are most Democrats and most Republicans and most of the American people believe that the federal government, that the Democratic Party is in favor of big government and the Republican Party more in favor of state government and local control. In fact, I want to argue that this is really not so, and that it really depends on which party controls which forum, if you will, or which set of governments in the country. Because what the parties are really interested in is policy that they agree with, rather than some more fundamental principle about how power ought to be distributed. So, what you see in this simple bar chart is as follows. On the left is those states that have a Republican governor. And almost all of those states chose, at least initially, to allow the federal government to offer the healthcare exchange, the health insurance exchange to the people in their state. In other words, almost all of the Republican governors refused to set up a state health exchange, even though the law allowed that. So the governors, most of whom in theory would have been expected to want more state control, said, we're not doing this. We're going to let the federal government do it. On the other hand, the states that had either an independent governor or a Democratic governor were much more likely to set up their own exchanges. And the governor of of Kentucky has been very prominent nationally in touting, Beshear, I think his name is, very visible in touting the state exchange in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. By the way, the source of this data is Kaiser Health, and if you want one single best non-governmental body in the country and online to get your information on healthcare policy, there is no one finer than Kaiser. They are very, very good. And so, under the Affordable Care Act, this is a map of where coverage through the end of August of last year, not quite 6 months ago, was expanded for Medicaid. So what you can see is this is an example of the initial resistance of Republican states to the full implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Again, going back, this is the gray area is where they refused to implement, okay? And the green area is where they did implement. And so, again, this is an example of how one, the political party in control in the state can have an impact on the implementation of federal law and of how the implementation of federal programs, even major federal programs, doesn't simply come out of Washington or some bureaucracy, but in fact there's major control of implementation of federal programs and federal law in state government. Any comments at this point?
No.
Okay. Shout out if you've got them or questions.
None.
Okay. What I'm now going to explain to you, as best I'm able, is the argument in the most important book on American government. The author of the book was a man named E.E. Schachtschneider. He was a political scientist at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And he wrote this book about 55 years ago. And what I want to do is try to describe for you his argument. He will be referenced in the chapter on interest groups. There'll be some discussion of his views, but I want to use him to talk about the scope of government and the nature of democracy and the federal system and political change, finally, which is the main topic for your writing assignment number 2. This is difficult material. And so please interrupt me if I go too fast or if there's something you don't understand. I will not be upset in the least if you interrupt. So, point number 1. Schachtschneider argued, by the way, it's a very small book. It's maybe 150, 60 pages. Print's kind of big. It's a pretty quick read, but it's very, very good. First, Schachtschneider defines democracy as the socialization of conflict. So the question is, what does that mean? Imagine a world where our society, where there's no government. And basically, those people who have a lot of money, assuming there is money, or who have a lot of physical power or control of the means of violence, guns, weapons, numbers of people, will be able to accomplish whatever they want. There is no governmental body who will protect anybody. All there is people trying to take and maintain and grow whatever power, whatever control of stuff, of land, of resources, of people that they can. Everything is decided privately. And it's not decided through talking, but rather through force and fraud. So what Schachtschneider is saying is what a government does, what it is a vehicle for taking conflicts and disputes, which in its absence would be private, into or under the auspices of governments. Third parties. Governments help make conflicts bigger and bring as many folks as possible into the conflict as actors and as audience. And that's in fact what Madison was trying to do with the Constitution. Get as many different interests represented in at least one way in the national government, so that the conflict would have to be within the governmental structure, not against or outside it. So rather than beat each other up, kill each other, steal from each other routinely, we have some set of organizations in the society to try to resolve all these issues. Democrats tend to be associated, or at least liberals, with a greater role for government in making societal decisions. Republicans, a more reduced role. So, in applying Schachtschneider's analysis to federalism, I'm going to offer two metaphors. The first one is the three-ring circus. Probably some of you have been to the circus. And one of your problems or challenges at the three-ring circus is to see what's going on in all of them. And sometimes you can't really look at all three and take it all in. Sometimes you have to focus on one, sometimes another, maybe two, depending on what interests you. What the framers did was set up multiple arenas or forums. Federal government, we've already had state governments, and local governments. So we have three rings. And they're American citizens, they're interest groups, they're political parties, they're businesses, they're nonprofit organizations. There's all kinds of people and groups and interests who want to have government do or not do X, Y, or Z. So to start off, they're kind of like the spectators at the three-ring circus, except they're also political actors, people with political rights, people with resources, people with interests, people with policy preferences, or groups with policy preferences. And so what political actors do is they have to look at their resources and their expertise in the political landscape and figure out what arena is going to make most sense for them to play in. If you want to understand voting rights issues, if you want to understand gay rights and gay marriage issues, the Affordable Care Act, gun regulation, almost abortion, reproductive rights, almost any issue you can think of in American government today, no political actor has enough resources to put huge amounts of money and personnel into each arena. They need to figure out, they want to figure out, what is the venue, what is the arena where I am most likely to achieve at least some of the policy outcomes that I want. Think about this in terms of shopping online. You want to buy a pair of jeans. 50 million different places sell jeans. 20 of them are going to sell the jeans that you want exactly. Some of them will have your size. Some of them may not. Some of them may have the color. Some of them may not. Some of them may charge for shipping. Some of them may not. Some of them may charge tax. Some of them may not. So you sort through all of these possible vendors to find out what makes most sense. And there are other things as well. How soon do you need them? Well, maybe the waist is okay, but the length is wrong. So there are all kinds of factors that, assuming you have the time and the resources and the technology to shop for the right seller of the product you want. In politics, political actors do the same thing, only they're not shopping for jeans, they're shopping for the place that's most likely to help them achieve their policy goal. They don't really care, despite what they say. My view is they don't really care as much about where that decision is made. They just want it to be in their favor and to make it stick. This is one of the, assuming I'm right, this is one of the reasons American politics is so crazy and irrational in some sense. This is why, based on this analysis, I've described democracy in America as a political system where nothing is ever finally settled. Recent example. Eventually, it may get finally settled, but I don't know. So the Supreme Court makes a decision that says to the state of Alabama, you've got to grant gay marriages. You've got to allow people who are gay to apply for marriage licenses and be married. So half the counties say okay, and half the counties say no. The Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court says, no way. I'm stopping this. This will not happen. Some counties say, hey, I know how we can fix this problem. Nobody's going to get a marriage license. We're not going to discriminate. Nobody can get married in our county. Nobody's going to get a marriage license because we're opposed to gay people being married. Probably this conflict in one way or another is still going on. So, and there are other court decisions yet to come on this particular issue. But the point is not the issue. The point is that this happens over and over and over and over and over and over again, no matter the issue. When you lose in American politics, you're not losing the war, you're losing a skirmish. And you look for other ways to achieve your policy goals. You don't just disband and go home. Very rarely. You look for another way to achieve your goals, policy goals. So we're out of time right now. We have another minute or two. I want to talk, there's only 2 more slides, but will take some time because this is complicated stuff. So we will meet again Thursday, same time, 9:45. And what I want to be able to do is to finish up talking about federalism and talk about your writing assignment 2 in some detail so you have a very good sense of what it's about. With the 1 minute I have remaining, as you read the chapters, you know, earlier at the beginning I said American politics is very complicated stuff. We make it complicated. As you read chapters 4 and 5, and as you look at the PowerPoints from chapters 4 and 5, I want you to consider this. Now, I happen to be a big supporter of civil liberties and civil rights, but please note the difference between the two and what we are asking our government to do. For civil liberties, we're saying, government, do not mess with my private life. I have rights. You have limits. You respect them. When we're talking civil rights, we're saying, government, we've got the 14th Amendment and the Declaration of Independence. And all men and women are equal, and there's supposed to be equal protection of the laws, and you have to enforce laws in such a way that this value of equality is upheld. And when people's equal rights are violated, you have to step up and fix it. We're asking two totally contradictory things of government. Think about that difficulty. See you on Thursday at 9:45.